What is the UNFCCC? UNFCCC, or UNFCCC, stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's an international environmental treaty that was created in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The treaty aims to stabilise the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous global warming. So why was the UNFCCC created? Well, during the 1980s, scientists were getting increasingly concerned that greenhouse gas emissions had the potential to transform our climate in dangerous ways. So in 1988, governments decided to create an international scientific body to provide them with advice on this issue. The body was called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You might have heard it referred to as the IPCC. It issued its first report 2 years later in 1990, showing the link between greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. The report helped persuade governments to prepare a treaty to prevent dangerous climate change. This is the UNFCCC. In 1994, 2 years after it was adopted, the treaty entered into force after being ratified by 50 governments. Today, 193 countries and the European Community have ratified the UNFCCC, making it one of the most universally supported international agreements. Now, although the treaty was signed more than 15 years ago, negotiations continue. Fundamentally, there are three issues that countries are trying to agree on. What constitutes dangerous climate change? How can we stop it? And how can countries adapt to a warming world? So how does the UNFCCC work? Well, first off, there are a number of important principles laid out in the text. Let's start with equity. This says that the parties to the convention, i.e. everyone who has ratified the UNFCCC, should protect the climate on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This principle basically means that rich industrialised countries should act first to mitigate their emissions. These countries have emitted more greenhouse gases historically and are therefore more responsible for causing climate change. Rich countries also have greater resources to tackle the issue. Developing countries, by contrast, are less responsible and are less able to respond to the problem, but they're more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Secondly, precaution. Now, the principle of precaution says we shouldn't take any risk if it's the future of our planet at stake, which seems sensible. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing mitigation measures. In other words, if most of the evidence points towards damaging climate change, we should do something. And sustainable development. Now, this principle highlights that development and climate change are intrinsically linked. It says that economic development is essential for adopting measures to address climate change, and that parties to the UNFCCC should cooperate to promote a supportive and open international economic system delivering global benefits. Okay, so those are the broad principles. Now we'll look at the structure. All of the countries that have ratified the UNFCCC meet once a year in the Conference of Parties, or the COP. It's the highest decision-making body within the UNFCCC, and every country has equal status. It reviews the implementation of the convention, and is a venue where countries negotiate and adopt new commitments. There are two main subsidiary bodies to the COP. They assess progress and recommend decisions. The Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice, SUBSTA, advises on scientific, technological and methodological issues. The Subsidiary Body for Implementation, as its name suggests, oversees assessment and review of the Convention's implementation. As well as these two standing subsidiary bodies, the COP can form ad hoc subsidiary bodies to carry out specific tasks. The Convention also establishes a Secretariat. Its main tasks are to organise the major meetings and conferences, to oversee and review monitoring procedures, and to prepare official documents for the COP and its subsidiary bodies. The Secretariat is accountable through its Executive Secretary. Parties to the UNFCCC are those countries that have ratified, accepted, approved or acceded to the treaty. The Convention divides countries into three main groupings: Annex 1, Annex 2 and Non-Annex 1, and each of these groupings has differing commitments. There are 40 Annex 1 countries, and the European Union is also a member. These countries are classified as industrialised countries and countries in transition. They've committed to reducing their emissions levels under the UNFCCC. Annex II countries are a subgroup of Annex I. They accepted a commitment to provide financial aid to developing countries to meet their costs under the UNFCCC. Annex II parties also agreed to transfer environmentally sound technologies to other parties to enable them to reduce their emissions. Non-Annex I countries are the more than 150 mostly developing countries that have ratified or acceded to the UNFCCC but are not included in Annex I of the Convention. Many of the countries that have ratified the UNFCCC have joined negotiating blocs in the talks. These are groups with similar interests. The Umbrella Group is a loose coalition of non-EU developed countries. They have a bit of a reputation for blocking real action. The EU tries to get unified negotiating positions in advance of COPs and negotiating sessions, and at the sessions themselves, it accepts overall emissions targets on behalf of the whole of the EU, and then these are divided between its member countries. The Environmental Integrity Group is a newer grouping that includes Mexico, Switzerland and South Korea. The G77 and China is a bloc of developing countries that actually has more than 130 members. They try to establish common negotiating positions, but because there's a wide range of interests represented, that's not always possible. So there's some important negotiating blocs whose members are also part of the G77. One of these is AOSIS. This stands for the Alliance of Small Island States. These are low-lying countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. There's also the least developed countries, 48 countries that are recognised by the UN as being those with the lowest development. And OPEC. This is the oil cartel of oil-producing nations. They have a particularly bad reputation for blocking progress on the talks. So how does the Kyoto Protocol fit in with this UNFCCC process? Well, at the first COP, which took place in 1995, the parties agreed that voluntary commitments wouldn't be enough to stop dangerous global warming. So they launched a new round of talks to decide legally binding commitments for rich countries. After 2.5 years of negotiations, these talks culminated in the Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted at COP3 in Japan. The Kyoto Protocol is intended to strengthen the UNFCCC by creating binding targets for rich, industrialised countries. It shares the same principles and the same ultimate objectives as the UNFCCC. It divides countries into the same groupings, Annex I, Annex II, and non-Annex I parties, and it shares the Convention's institutions. Before the Protocol could enter into force, 55 parties to the Convention had to ratify it, including Annex I parties accounting for 55% of that group's carbon dioxide emissions in 1990. Following ratification by Russia in late 2004, the Protocol achieved these criteria, and it entered into force 90 days later, on the 16th of February 2005. It established legally binding emissions targets for industrialised countries that require an average 5.2% reduction in Annex I party emissions on 1990 levels between 2008 and 2012, the first commitment period. The most notable country not to have ratified the protocol is the United States. It was widely accepted, however, that the Kyoto Protocol alone couldn't meet the objectives of the UNFCCC. Even if it was ratified by all Annex I countries, it would only mean a small reduction in emissions, and that would only be in force until 2012. Furthermore, because its mandate is limited to establishing targets for Annex I parties, it wouldn't be sufficient even with further commitment periods. In an effort to address this, in 2005 a dialogue on long-term cooperative action was established at COP11. 2 years later, at COP13 in Bali, the outcome of the dialogue was consensus that any future agreement should be based on 4 building blocks: mitigation, adaptation, finance and technology. The Bali Action Plan, or Bali Roadmap, called for a 2-year negotiation to agree on these issues, in parallel with the Kyoto Protocol talks. Thus there are 2 tracks to the negotiating process: the ad hoc working group on further commitments from Annex I parties under the Kyoto Protocol, known as the KP track, or AWG-KP, and the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action under the Convention, known as the LCA track, or AWG-LCA. We'll explore these in more detail in another video. Both of these negotiating tracks were aiming to reach agreement at COP15 in Copenhagen, which is why it was so hyped up. Now unfortunately that didn't happen. The working groups of these tracks are now due to report at COP16 in Mexico, with hopes for an agreement at COP17 in South Africa. Okay, well there's my effort at explaining the UNFCCC in about 10 minutes. If you'd like to explore this presentation in more detail, then you can visit this address,